We live in an age of absolute visibility. We move through our lives under the constant, unblinking gaze of surveillance. From traffic signals to ATM vestibules, from convenience stores to the device in your pocket, we leave a digital footprint that proves we exist. We assume that if something terrible were to happen to us, if we were to vanish, the cameras would at least tell the story of our departure. They would show the moment we walked away or the moment we were taken. But what happens when the camera sees you enter but never sees you leave? What happens when a human being walks into a crowded room surrounded by friends and witnesses and simply evaporates into the ether? This is not a ghost story. This is not a locked room mystery from a paperback novel. This is the case of Brian Shaffer, a man who walked into a bar in Columbus, Ohio, and became one of the most disturbing anomalies in modern missing persons history. The horror here isn't gore or violence. The horror is the physics of the disappearance itself. It is the terrifying realization that a man can exist 1 second and in the next become nothing more than static. To understand the impossibility of what happened on April 1st, 2006, we first have to understand the man at the center of the void. Brian Shaffer was 27 years old. He was a second-year medical student at Ohio State University, a young man who, by all accounts, had the world at his feet. He was intelligent, charismatic, and disciplined. He had a steady girlfriend, Alexis, whom he planned to propose to. He had a close relationship with his family. To the outside observer, Brian was the picture of American success. But beneath the surface, the ground was shifting. 3 weeks prior to that night, Brian's mother, Renee, had passed away from myelodysplasia, a rare form of blood cancer. Her death had been a sledgehammer blow to the family. Brian was close to his mother. Her loss left him unmoored. Friends described him as exhausted, oscillating between the intense pressure of medical school exams and the profound, heavy grief of mourning. He was tired. He was stressed. And on the night of Friday, March 31st, 2006, he just wanted a release. Classes were out for spring break. The heavy academic load was temporarily lifted. Brian met his father, Randy, for a steak dinner earlier that evening. Witnesses and his father both noted that Brian seemed weary, perhaps a bit withdrawn. But he spoke about the future. He spoke about Alexis. He didn't sound like a man planning to walk away from his life. He sounded like a man trying to survive the week. After dinner, the night shifted gears. Brian met up with his best friend, William Clint Florence, at a spot called the Ugly Tuna Saloona. It is crucial to visualize this location because the architecture of the building is the central character in this mystery. The Ugly Tuna was located in the South Campus Gateway complex. It was not on the ground floor. To enter the bar, patrons had to walk into the building from the street, navigate a small hallway, and ascend a steep escalator to the second level. This escalator is the choke point. It is the funnel. At the top of the escalator was the main entrance to the bar, and pointing directly at that entrance, capturing every single person coming up and going down, was a security camera. Brian and Clint started their night there, but they didn't stay. They began a process of bar hopping, moving down High Street, consuming a significant amount of alcohol. They drifted from the Ugly Tuna to the Arena District, stopping at the North Short Tavern and Brothers Bar and Grill. At each stop, the night became a little more blurred. Brian was drinking heavily, perhaps self-medicating the grief that had been shadowing him for weeks. He was social, he was talking to strangers, but he was also becoming increasingly intoxicated. Around 1:15 a.m., the two men, now joined by a friend named Meredith Reed, decided to circle back to where the night began. They returned to the South Campus Gateway. They walked through the ground floor entrance. They stepped onto the escalator. At 1:15 a.m. on April 1st, 2006, the security camera at the top of the escalator recorded Brian Shaffer, Clint Florence, and Meredith Reed riding up to the second floor. Brian is seen clearly. He is wearing a long-sleeved polo shirt over a t-shirt, jeans, and a white Adidas hat. He looks like any other college student on a Friday night. He walks into the Ugly Tuna Saloona. he was never seen outside of that bar again. The atmosphere inside the bar was chaotic. It was closing time approached, the crowd was dense, the music was loud, and the air was thick with the energy of students kicking off their break. Shortly after arriving, the group separated. This is a common occurrence in crowded bars. Someone goes to the bathroom, someone goes to the bar to grab a round, someone stops to talk to a familiar face. At some point, Brian drifted away from Clint and Meredith. He was seen chatting with two women near the bar. The timeline here is tight. It is now approaching 2 a.m., the mandatory closing time for bars in Ohio. The lights were coming up, the bartenders were shouting for last call, the security staff began herding patrons toward the exit. Clint and Meredith waited for Brian. They stood near the exit, scanning the crowd as it thinned out. They watched the stream of people flowing back down the escalator. They checked their phones, they called Brian. It went straight to voicemail. They waited. The crowd dwindled until the staff began to push them out. They assumed, as anyone would, that they had simply missed him. Maybe he had slipped past them in the crush of people. Maybe he had gone to the bathroom and then walked back to his apartment, which was only 6 blocks away. It was a reasonable assumption. In the haze of a late night out, friends get separated. It happens. Clint and Meredith left the Ugly Tuna. They stood outside on the street, calling Brian again. Still no answer. They went home, expecting to hear from him the next morning. But the next morning brought only silence. Saturday passed. No calls, no texts. Alexis, his girlfriend, tried to reach him, but his phone remained dead. Sunday arrived. Brian was scheduled to fly to Miami with Alexis on Monday for a spring break trip he had been looking forward to. When he failed to show up for the flight, the unease that had been building over the weekend turned into panic. On Monday morning, the police were notified. A missing persons report was filed. The search for Brian Shaffer began, and almost immediately the investigation hit a wall that defied logic. The detectives went straight to the Ugly Tuna Saloona. They demanded the security footage. They needed to know when Brian left and who he was with. They expected to see him stumbling out at 2:05 a.m., perhaps alone, perhaps followed by someone. They sat down in the security room and began to review the tape from the camera overlooking the escalator, the only public entrance and exit to the bar. They watched the footage from 1:15 a.m. They saw Brian, Clint, and Meredith go up. They saw them enter the bar. Then they fast-forwarded to the end of the night. They watched the exodus. They watched every single person leave the bar. They counted them. They cross-referenced faces. They watched from 1:55 a.m. until the bar was empty and the staff locked the doors. Brian Shaffer was not on the tape. The detectives were baffled. They rewound the footage. They watched it again, frame by frame. They watched the entire night in real time. At 1:55 a.m., Brian is spotted on the footage. He is standing just outside the bar's entrance, near the top of the escalator, talking to two young women. He appears lucid, though intoxicated. He has a brief conversation. He then turns and moves back into the bar, moving off camera, presumably toward the bathroom or the bar area. That is the last verified sighting of Brian Shaffer. The police determined that he re-entered the bar minutes before closing, and yet he never came back out. The camera captured every other patron leaving. It captured the staff leaving. It captured the lights turning off. But Brian Shaffer remained, effectively inside the system. This is where the case moves from a standard disappearance to a disturbing anomaly. If he didn't go down the escalator, how did he leave? The investigators tore the building apart. They looked for other exits. There was a service elevator in the back of the kitchen. However, this elevator opened into a loading dock that was heavily monitored. To use it, one would have to navigate through the kitchen, past the staff who were cleaning up. The footage from the loading dock was pulled. No Brian. There was a fire exit. This door led to a stairwell that opened out onto the street level. But this was an emergency door. It was equipped with a panic bar. If anyone opened it, a piercing alarm would have sounded, alerting the entire staff and the managers closing out the registers. No alarm was triggered that night. Furthermore, the door was fitted with a camera on the exterior side. That footage was reviewed. No one exited that door. The police were left with a mathematical impossibility. A man entered a second-story room. The only way out was down an escalator, a service elevator, or a fire escape. All three were monitored by witnesses, cameras, or alarms. None of them registered his passage. The search radius expanded. If he wasn't in the bar and he wasn't seen leaving, was he still inside the building? The South Campus Gateway was a complex structure, and parts of it were under construction or renovation. Police brought in cadaver dogs. They swept the Ugly Tuna. They swept the hallways. They swept the ventilation shafts. They swept the construction zones nearby. They checked the dumpsters. They checked the sewers. The dogs picked up a scent near the escalator, but the trail went cold immediately at the exit, as if he had simply ceased to be. Theories began to spiral, each one more desperate than the last. One theory suggested that Brian had managed to change his clothes inside the bar, perhaps putting on a hoodie or a hat he found, and walked out past the cameras disguised as someone else. Investigators re-watched the tapes, looking for anyone who matched Brian's height and build, regardless of clothing. They analyzed the gait of every male leaving the bar. They found no matches. Everyone who left was accounted for. Another theory, far more grim, posited that Brian had stumbled into the construction area adjacent to the bar, that perhaps he had found an unlocked door, walked into the dark, unfinished skeleton of the building, and fallen into a wet concrete pour or into a wall void that was subsequently sealed. The police used ground-penetrating radar. They inspected the blueprints. They found no evidence of a body in the walls or the foundation. But the idea lingers, the thought that he is entombed in the architecture of the city. Then the focus turned to the people who were with him. Meredith Reed cooperated fully with the police. She was distraught, confused, and passed a polygraph test. But Clint Florence, Brian's best friend, took a different path. Clint lawyered up almost immediately. He refused to take a polygraph. He refused to speak to the family. His attorney stated that Clint had told the police everything he knew that night, that they got separated and he didn't know where Brian went, and that he had nothing more to add. This silence cast a long, dark shadow over the investigation. Was Clint hiding something? Did an argument occur? Did something happen in the chaos of the bar that Clint felt the need to protect himself from? Or was he simply a young man following legal advice, knowing that in the eyes of the law, the last person to see the victim is often the first suspect? There is no evidence linking Clint to any foul play, but his refusal to help the family search created a rift that never healed. As the weeks turned into months, the pressure on the Shaffer family became unbearable. Brian's father, Randy, began his own crusade. He spent his retirement savings hiring private investigators. He consulted psychics. He spent his weekends walking the banks of the Olentangy River, looking for a body, looking for a shoe, looking for anything. In September 2006, 5 months after the disappearance, a strange event occurred. Alexis, Brian's girlfriend, was still calling his phone every day just to hear his voicemail. One night, it didn't go to voicemail. It rang. It rang 3 times. The ping was traced to a cell tower in Hilliard, Ohio, a suburb miles away from the bar. For a brief, agonizing moment, there was hope. Was Brian alive? Was he holding the phone? Was he running away? The hope was crushed as quickly as it rose. The authorities determined it was likely a glitch in the network, a phantom ring caused by the carrier system. Brian's phone was never found. It has never been turned on since that night. The tragedy of the Shaffer family did not end with Brian's disappearance. 2 years later, in September 2008, a heavy windstorm swept through Ohio. Randy Shaffer was out in his yard, cleaning up debris. A dead branch from a tree fell, striking him. He was killed instantly. Randy died without ever knowing what happened to his son. He died with a mystery still burning a hole in his life. In the span of 2 years, the Shaffer family was decimated. Mother, son, and father, all gone. Brian's younger brother was left alone to carry the weight of the silence. So, what happened in the Ugly Tuna Saloona? There are only a few possibilities, and none of them are comforting. The first is that Brian Shaffer pulled off the perfect disappearance. That, overwhelmed by the death of his mother and the pressure of medical school, he orchestrated a vanish. He noticed the camera blind spots. He slipped out in a way the police missed. He walked away from his life, his debts, and his grief, and started over somewhere else. Sightings of Brian have been reported all over the world, in Sweden, in Texas, in the Caribbean. None have ever been confirmed. And those who knew him say he would never have done this to his father. He saw what his mother's death did to Randy. He wouldn't have inflicted a second loss. The second possibility is that he was murdered inside the bar, that he ran afoul of someone, a staff member, another patron, and was killed in a bathroom or a back hallway. His body would have been smuggled out, perhaps in a trash can, perhaps in a cooler, right under the noses of the cameras and witnesses. It implies a conspiracy of silence among the bar staff that has held for nearly 2 decades. It seems improbable, yet the alternative is impossible. The third possibility is the most unsettling, that he left the bar by accident, that he found a door unlocked that should have been locked, that he walked into a service corridor, intoxicated and confused, and fell into a space where he was never found, that he is still there, somewhere in the infrastructure of the South Campus Gateway, a silent resident in a building that thousands of people walk through every day. We want to believe that the world makes sense. We want to believe that objects and people possess permanence. We rely on the logic of cause and effect. If you walk in, you must walk out. But Brian Shaffer challenges that logic. He walked into the light of a public place, surrounded by the noise of the living, and the darkness simply swallowed him whole. When you look at the freeze frame of Brian at 1:55 a.m. talking to those 2 women, you are looking at a ghost. He is there, solid, real, alive. And then he turns his back to the camera. He walks toward the bar, and the film runs out. There is no body. There is no weapon. There is no motive. There is only the tape. And on the tape, there is no way out.